Cool. Thanks for having me.
And then Simon, I think you'll be able to share your screen, but just in case if we get technology glitches or anything, you can also just send me a link and I can download it as well. Welcome
Okay.
everybody.
We can do that.
And we'll give people a few minutes while everyone is still connecting. Uh,
Sure.
as is customary, the opening of the class is any new folks introducing themselves, folks who might not have joined in the past. Uh, I'm actually curious if people have any reflections on what's happening in the political climate as well. If you feel like this is a close group of people, the world is. I don't know, Fabian or anybody else. Uh, I think we should just all realize this has been a very anxiety-filled and quite a stressful time for just everyone, and that continues to be that way. And let's be kind and listening to each other in as many ways as we can. I think a sense of community couldn't be more important now than any other time. Uh, yeah, Fabian or anybody else who wants to reflect on what's unfolding and how people are coping up with things, though. I'm sure from far away, many of the international communities are watching what's happening in the current US political climate with a absolute shock of uh, and all kinds of worries that we all have as well. But at least the needle is moving in the direction of science. The fact that science was referenced again for the first time after a long while is at least some solace to what's happening. Any new folks connecting today that want to do a quick intro? Otherwise, we're going to jump to today's big agenda is on conservation. And I want to give a context to this as well in a second. Okay, so I don't see any comments per se. Maybe John, you want to mention something, or this is sort of our open free time? Okay, yeah, just share your comments. I think it's very important that as a community that you can share diverse sets of opinions. We can do that on the chat. Uh, Today we're going to transition into just like the deep dive that we did on TB as an example, and both the challenges and also what happens with and without COVID. On the health side, last week with Madhu, we are very pleased to have Simon join us today. And I guess I'm assuming, Simon, you're calling from South Africa right now.
Yep, from South Africa.
And Simon is the Associate Director of Conservation at the Center for Computational Evolutionary and Human Genomics. Simon and I met more recently when he has moved to Stanford, but I think also via the connection of Liz. And Liz has not been able to join more recently. But one of the things that's exciting about this is a concerted effort is happening, at least not just on this campus, but around the world to bring technologies to the realm of the questions of conservation, but keeping the folks that are truly in the fight of conservation at the heart of all of this, which is, again, just like we think about in health, keeping the health workers at the heart of it. And I think Simon joins with a lot of experience. I'm just going to read his small bio as an introduction. His research focus has been on the past on black rhino reintroduction ecology and working for the last 13 years in South Africa. And he co-founded Wildlife Act, an NGO. And of course, one of the big threads that I was very excited first meeting with Simon was his focus on monitoring technologies, conservation management, and also just his insights on what really happens on the ground in national parks around the world. So I think today's discussion is going to be very open-ended. I think we're going to spend maybe the first hour or so hearing from Simon and the sets of threads that are unfolding, but then transition in the very last half an hour to discussion on uh, the need for conservation technologies, but also the need for making sure that they're truly accessible, and the folks that are at the heart of this are part of this conversation as well. So I think with that note, Simon, I want to pass to you if you want to share your screen.
Thanks very much.
The audience that you're
yeah,
listening to is a very broad audience, from technologists to anthropologists to social scientists, but young people from around the world who are passionate about frugal science and the act
great,
of making technology as broadly accessible as possible. So it's a really
great.
broad group of people. There are mentors who are ecologists, but what brings all of us together is the common theme of making sure that technological solutions should actually be accessible. So just as a background for the context of the class. And we've been meeting as a class twice a week with lots of projects that are also associated around conservation. So maybe in the very end, I'll ask the teams that are working on conservation technology, especially there are 2 or 3 teams to actually introduce themselves as well.
Awesome. Well, thanks very much. I appreciate that, Manu. Just to let you know, when I share my screen, everybody here disappears and I can't see the chat, but please feel free to interject at any time. But if you raise your hand, I won't be able to see you. So please just stop me and ask a question. It's meant to be an open discussion, so please feel free to do that. And Tyler, maybe if you're watching the chat, you could just jump in on other people's behalf.
Sounds perfect.
Fine.
Yeah, I think this, Simon, will be a very informal discussion. So please folks should feel free to interrupt, ask lots of questions.
Great. So I'm going to run through a little bit about kind of broadly conservation in Africa and some of the challenges that we're facing, and especially currently, and touch on a couple of things, and also talk a little bit about the COVID impacts. As Manu mentioned, I'm doing some work for the Program for Conservation Genomics at Stanford, and also co-founded Wildlife Act, which is an NGO based in South Africa. And I'm actually spending my time split between the 2 entities and doing work for the Program for Conservation Genomics. And we're really looking at kind of threatened and endangered species across their range and developing genoscapes, so trying to understand the genetic diversity across their ranges, and helping to think about developing tools, non-invasive type of tools. So looking at, for example, picking up DNA from scat and hair and the likes, to be able to place individuals within these genoscapes, as well as being able to identify the different individuals from a forensics perspective as well. So we're doing a lot of that work with a number of different species. And a lot of my work is involved with the conservation groups on the ground, trying to access historical biological samples, tissue samples, for us to do whole genome sequencing on, to identify the specific markers or the SNPs that will help with a lot of this work. So a lot of
Simon,
time spent.
Going back to the picture before, what is just so obvious immediately when you look at this is the fractured nature of this landscapes. And I know you'll talk about this when we talk about conservation park, but maybe for the audience, could you just briefly describe why, when you fracture ecological landscapes, it is a big challenge on what happens on populations? And just, I think there's a story to tell, right, when I look at this picture carefully.
Exactly.
So historically, in the historical context, what has taken place in Africa across the last 50, 100 years?
Yeah, exactly. I think here what we're really trying to highlight and show is how the diversity happens. And as soon as you start fracturing it, we'll start seeing this kind of merging of colors from one area to the other, changing and just getting homogenization in these small populations. Unfortunately, what's happening is that there's a lot of movement unnatural movement and migration between populations that's happening. So for example, there's a lot of lions being moved out of South Africa into these other populations as rewilding exercises. And the problem with that is obviously the homogenizing effect that we're having across these populations, which is problematic. But a lot of people don't know that the African lion population is actually halved since the release of the Lion King. And that's quite a hectic number to think about. And we think that the population's down to about 10 to 15,000 individuals at the moment. So this actually isn't a very accurate depiction of where you would expect the numbers. The numbers don't relate to this. This range looks a lot bigger than what it actually is at the moment. Yeah, so a lot of my work is involved with the conservation groups on the ground, trying to access these biological samples to inform the development of these tools by the team at PCG. A lot of this work being done with Professor Dimitri Petrov in the biology department. And then from a Wildlife Act perspective, a lot of the work focusing in this landscape in the Zululand area of South Africa, right on the Swaziland and the Mozambique border, which runs up at the top here. Small numbers of small reserves that are largely fenced reserves and very intensively managed. And our contribution to the management is a lot of the management orientated monitoring systems that we deploy across these areas. And we've actually just celebrated our 12th year and put a little video together. And I thought that would probably be the easiest way to just give you a quick insight into some of the work that we've been doing. I'm going to try and see if this plays. Just let me know if you can hear it or not. Okay, I don't think the video is playing.
Is there an online version? Or if you escape from your presentation mode, then you might be.
I was just thinking.
I will look for it. If it's on the website, I can play it from my end.
Yeah, it's on the YouTube. Let me just have a quick. I can grab it. Let's see if I can find.
So I found the Wildlife Act YouTube channel, and I think I have the video
should
here.
Be it. Yeah, it's the first. It's the first video there. The 12 years of impact.
Yeah, I just got it. So people can let me know if they can.
That's it.
Yeah.
It's incredibly difficult to protect something when you don't know where it is or how to find it or how many there are or if there is any left. Monitoring endangered African species is critical to their conservation. But many reserves don't have the means or capacity to do so. The Wildlife Act has changed that.
Thanks, Manu. I'll just go back
I
to.
just have to say that was me.
Thanks. So I think one thing worth looking at there was just you spoke about the various technologies, the extensive use of whether it's testing lead in the vultures, vulture bloods, or the little backpacks that we're putting on the vultures, the camera traps that we use, the satellite tracking that we have on the wild dogs and the likes, and anti-snare plates that we have to try and stop the dogs from getting caught in snares. An extensive use of technologies on the ground from a monitoring perspective. And as Zama said in the beginning there, it's very difficult to conserve what you don't know you've got and where they are in the numbers. So monitoring forms we see as a critical part of conservation efforts. So that was just to give you a bit of an insight into kind of conservation on the ground, at least within that area, but many of the spaces where it's quite a hands-on approach in some of these, especially fenced and protected areas. If we look across the continent at the extent of the protected areas, you can see that they're scattered throughout. And in some areas, for example, here in Angola, you can see there's not many formally protected areas, and in other areas, for example, in Zambia, you see an extent, same in Tanzania, where there's a lot of hunting reserves that are also kind of noted as protected areas. One of the first things I like to do when I speak about Africa is to just give some context and from a size perspective. So this is just an example of how the rest of the world kind of fits into Africa, and Africa is not well kind of seen on a map because of the way that the globe sits, and it looks smaller than it really is. So this is just to give some kind of context to the extent of the continent. And then another element I like to kind of bring to everyone's attention is that it's the one continent where we are seeing continued growth in the human population. And if you just simply look at projections around 2045, you'll see that the population is expected to double. So all of those issues that we're facing, from a pressure on protected areas, resource use and the likes, we can see a twofold increase in that happening going forward. So a lot of the elements associated with conservation are focused around development, the natural resources that are available. Corruption's a huge issue, poverty, and obviously civil unrest. So I just wanted to touch on a couple of these points and just to kind of highlight the current situation. Sorry, this came out a little bit blurry, but
and then Simon, before you jump into this, one thing I want to make sure. Yeah, just a quick comment. Maybe either now or at a later time, can you just describe briefly your journey into Wildlife Act? What happened for this to actually form, and as an organization, when you look at it and the impact on just more of a personal reflection of what was the seed, what led to the forming of the organization, and what are the lessons that you've learned?
I think the one main lesson I learned was during my PhD, is I realized I wasn't an academic as such, and that's
actually a good thing.
Yeah,
you can do far more.
Yeah, I think it was you end up publishing a couple of papers and then looking at it and realizing that the guys that you've been working with in the bush have more of a say in the outcomes of the conservation objectives in the immediate space, because they've been out there and interacting with the decision makers. And you've got to spend a lot of time with the decision makers on the ground to gain favor. They're not necessarily looking at the published papers necessarily. So kind of shifted my attention more towards field work and getting involved from that kind of a hands-on perspective on the ground more, and realizing that there is a big gap in the monitoring of populations and just this lack of knowledge. And a lot of that was also driven by the fact that a lot of the researchers teams that were out there doing work would come in for short periods of time, have their own agenda and leave. But the conservation managers weren't able to really call on the research community and direct them effectively with the questions that they wanted answered, as well as just day-to-day management questions associated with, where is that pack of wild dogs or that rhino? Is it in the reserve? Does it have a snare on it, for example? Or, has it been poached? When last was it seen? Often the researchers on the ground would come in with their own question and have a very kind of narrow specific focus and wouldn't be able to answer a lot of these day-to-day management questions. So that's why we set up these teams that are focused specifically on management-orientated monitoring systems and informing management, and the questions being driven by the managers. So that's kind of where it came from and where it started off. So within the space, and looking at the pressures that are associated, one of them is the poverty. And if we look across the continent, this year is the headcount ratio of people that are earning less than $5.50 a day. And they've got these ratios at different values, but I selected the 550 because I thought, it's an indication of maybe what your lunch might cost, or a cup of coffee or two and a donut. And you'll see that, for example, in Angola, where we saw a lack of formally protected areas, most of the population, 80% of the population, is living on less than $5.50 a day. But when you kind of delve into it and look at it, and we zoom back into Angola, what we know about Angola is that they actually produce over 1.3, nearly 1.5 million barrels of oil per day, and have huge natural gas production. It's the second largest oil producing country in sub-Saharan Africa. However, in a 2004 Human Rights Watch report, they found that the use of oil revenue in Angola and its impact on human rights was hugely problematic. And it was shown that the government consistently mismanaged its substantial oil revenues, with billions of dollars of revenue missing and illegally bypassing their central bank and remaining unaccounted for. So just in the period from 1997 to 2002, there was over $4.5 billion of unaccounted funds. And in those same years, the total social spending in the country, including the government spending, as well as public and private initiatives funded, for example, through the United Nations, also came to about $4.5 billion. So in effect, the Angolan government had not accounted for an amount roughly equal to the total expenditure on humanitarian, social, health, and educational needs of their population. And this is clearly a population that's in severe distress at, at less than $5 a day. And now, more recently, we've seen that there's been a change over to a new president. However, there's still reports of over $24 billion missing from state-owned oil and diamond companies within Angola. So corruption playing a huge role in the state of many of the nations on the continent. And you can imagine what impact that has within the protected areas and the pressures that those play from a poverty perspective, as well as from trying to deal above board with government in terms of the management of protected areas and the use of natural resources, whether it's from oils to wood, etc. So then when you look at development within these spaces and the conservation and corruption kind of coupled with it, we know that it's hugely problematic in terms of trying to understand some of the directors of the government. So if we move across and we focus in Tanzania, there's a protected area here on the right-hand side called the Selous Game Reserve. It's the largest game reserve in Africa. So if we zoom in here, this is a Selous protected area. It's a noted World Natural Heritage Site, which is actually under a lot of pressure at the moment. And it covers an area of about 50,000 square kilometers, which is about 12.3 million acres, which is an area just smaller than West Virginia, to put it into context. So a massive area, and it's a natural park. Most of the park income in the past and all management was orientated around trophy hunting. But however, last year they reduced the park by over 60%. The current president, Magufuli, justified this move as a means of reducing the hunting tourism in the space. His comment was, tourists come here and kill our lions, but we don't benefit a lot from these wildlife hunting activities. And that's because a lot of that income is kept by overseas tourism operators. So he sliced up the reserve, and it's going to complicate its status. But what he's also done is put out exploration and mining concessions to Western and Russian oil, gas, and uranium companies, which will cover over 6% of the Selous, as well as you can see this massive dam, this flooded area. So this, it's a huge area. You're looking at about almost an 8 to 9% area of the park is going to be dammed up and underwater. But first, they're going to log that entire area. There's a lot of trees in that space. So by 2017, already there were about 48 different prospective oil, gas, and uranium concessions within the Selous. And you can imagine that coupled with the corruption within the space, and we know a lot about Tanzania and corruption levels, we know that this is a huge loss. So from this kind of conservation versus development conundrum, I just wanted to read something I really suggest that if you have time or any interest is to read more from this paper when they're talking about the Selous. But here we go. Although many conservationists would challenge this view, it's difficult to see how fences and armed wardens can ward off climate change, even if they can prevent trespassing, illegal hunting and grazing, or how farmers and pastoralists can be empowered to conserve rather than degrade forests and grasslands in the absence of an effective state that can legislate, coordinate, and regulate the management of natural resources effectively and efficiently in the public interest. So even with the gathering storms of climate change and the obscenities of ivory poaching and wildlife trafficking, population growth and competition over finite resources are likely to lead us inexorably towards a comprehensive tragedy of the commons. So, this whole conservation versus development issue across the continent comes to the fore again and again. If it's not the corruption elements, we've also got to look at instability on the continent as well. So this is a map showing armed conflict.
Simon, just going back on the Selous side, if you go one slide back, can you just say a word about what led to the decision-making process, that sort of
Sure.
the structure of somebody proposed it? How open is that decision made? I mean, 60% of such a reserve suddenly being turned, it's a big decision. How does the community react to it? I'm just curious on the ground, what has been the reality of these? Yeah,
a very good question. Unfortunately, what we're seeing on the ground is that a lot of people in Tanzania that speak out against government and development of initiatives like that are often jailed. So and the press is restricted in terms of what they can say as well. So locally on the ground in Tanzania, there's not much that can happen. A lot of the big NGOs that work in the space, their hands are effectively tied, because if they speak out too much about some of these initiatives, their contracts won't get renewed, they'll be pushed out of the country. And we've seen that time and again happening with conservationists that have kind of waved the flag as such or put their hands up against things. So people that kind of have to toe the party line as much as possible and try and work on the ground as effectively as they can to try and affect some form of change. Interestingly here, what drove a lot of the decision making around these developments was that, as we all know, trophy hunting has taken a huge hit recently. You think of Cecil the lion and the impacts that had. Here, this protected area was mostly, as I mentioned, under the management of trophy hunters. And as soon as we started seeing those changes and trophy hunters not being able to pay the government anymore for permits, and that money not coming in, the government turned around and said, well, what else can we do? We've got tourist areas already across the country. They needed to diversify some of the income. So they've got the Serengeti, and the likes. So they turned to development within the space and different use of the space. So the first thing was creating a national park. So moving away from a game reserve, which is traditionally under hunting in Tanzania, to a national park status. for some of the area. They kind of ticked a block in terms of doing the right thing, but as I mentioned, it was almost a 60% reduction in the space, and then the focus in on these various development projects in the area. And a lot of that's obviously been pushed by these mining companies that are coming in here, and with corruption like it is, all of these prospectors, as I said, whether they're Western or Russian, the prospectors that are coming in are driving the negotiations to get access to these areas. So a lot of under-table dealing will be happening within that space. What's interesting is that the international community kicked up a big fuss around the proposed road development in the Serengeti, but we've yet to see a similar kind of outcry to this dam and to this mining that's happening within the Selous, which is kind of strange. And I think that that's largely based on the fact that the Selous doesn't have the exposure that the Serengeti does from a tourism perspective, but meanwhile is probably just as important an area from a conservation perspective. So this is just a map looking at conflict within protected areas over the last decade, and how that affected the protected areas from an extent, the number of years of conflict. You can see in some areas conflict was extensive from a period of time, but you know, a lot of people don't realize that this hasn't changed. There's still a lot of conflict happening within protected areas or in and around protected areas. And something to highlight, this happened literally, this was a news article that came up here. You'll see 19 hours ago, I downloaded this this afternoon. And this is in an area down here in northern Mozambique that we're seeing this insurgency happening. A lot of people being impacted over the last 3 months. We've seen over 2,000 people killed in this area in Cabo Delgado, and over nearly 500,000 people have been left homeless. And we know that as soon as we see these kind of attacks and tourism activity in these areas, is that we see people moving away from these areas, especially if they've been left homeless. So we'll see a mass migration of people out of these spaces, and they'll often move directly into the protected areas where there's available resources in the form of bushmeat. And here you can see where the Selous is that we were talking about not far away, and as well as this Nyassa Reserve, which we'll touch on again a little bit later. But you know, huge areas of protected areas that are now going to be inundated with people, homeless people that are migrating out. And we can just imagine what those impacts are going to be. Interestingly, in this Mozambique area where we're seeing this insurgency, they've found huge gas reserves, natural gas reserves, and there's an estimate $100 billion in revenue that'll come out of these gas reserves over the next 5 years or so. And again, we know that poverty is a huge issue in Mozambique, and we probably won't see any of those billions of dollars being invested into addressing some of these societal issues and the poverty within the regions, which means that natural resources are going to be plundered even further. I didn't know if at that point there was any, I just wanted to stop and see if there were any questions from anybody. Okay. So with a lot of this, with a lot of these issues, and we've also got to kind of consider the protection of the protected areas and how that's happening with all the poaching pressures that are currently happening.
Just a couple of minutes ago, there was a question around, of course, it was related to the video on the process of dehorning as a both as a technology and its impact. Maybe you could say a comment or two about it. Has it?
Yeah, that's great.
People thought,
I'm glad that came up. I'm going to go into a little bit about the rhino poaching issues and some of the things a little bit later. But from a anti-poaching perspective, it's by far one of the most effective tools that we've got is to dehorn rhino. But it's only effective in small populations. So the rhino horn is like your fingernail. You clip it and it grows. And so what we see is that we have to dehorn rhinos probably every 15 months to be able to keep that horn level low enough to prevent poaching. So in any population greater than 100 to 150 individuals, we just can't fly the choppers enough and keep them all dehorned effectively, because you can't dehorn only half of the population. You've got to dehorn all of them from an ecological perspective, and a fairness around the males fighting with one another, as well as being able to keep the poachers at bay effectively. So it's really around the bigger populations that we've got to focus in on different technologies and anti-poaching efforts. And one of those, unfortunately, is the militarization of conservation in Africa, and we're seeing this happening again and again. This is a picture of the South African National Parks helicopter and anti-poaching teams, which has really come to the fore in the recent years due to the increase of rhino poaching. So the Kruger National Park, with over 10,000 animals in 2010, that population is just too big to effectively dehorn those rhino. And so they kind of focused in on some community projects, but community engagement was difficult because the Kruger National Park is on a border with Mozambique, so the park sits in South Africa, and a lot of the poaching activity was coming out of Mozambique. So engaging across a border was really difficult from a community engagement perspective. So what we saw was that South African National Parks hired a retired Army Major General in and around 2010 to oversee the Kruger's anti-poaching operations, and they increased the aerial surveillance by means of reconnaissance aircraft, including remote operated drones. They procured partnerships with military firms, and this militarization of conservation practice in the Kruger and of the park itself is striking in a number of respects. And it's characterized by a number of layers of militarization from the ground right up into the skies, all enabled by, whether it's rangers, soldiers, military leaders, military firms. This was both public and private. And the resulting stateside militarization in particular has proven really lethal from a community perspective, and these poaching communities that live in very rural conditions in these areas, where during a 5-year period, they released some of the anti-poaching kill numbers, and over 300 poachers were killed during this time period. And when you think a lot of these actors, these poachers are poverty, they come from impoverished communities and are often coerced and bribed into these activities. It's a really sad state of affairs to see the impact that this militarization had on these communities. A lot of people look at this graph as well and assume that we're seeing a reduction in the poaching, which we are, but a lot of that reduction is being driven by the fact that there's just, in the Kruger has lost more than half of its population. So it's just getting harder and harder for the poachers to actually find the rhinos to poach. And as I said, in the smaller reserves, we're using the dehorning of the rhinos fairly effectively, which means we've been able to protect them in those areas quite well. So it's in these larger populations that we're still seeing them getting poached. And in fact, in the Kruger National Park just last year, saw its greatest numbers of insurgents coming into the park that they've seen yet. So there's still a lot of poachers in the park looking for rhino, they're just not effectively finding them. And these, unfortunately, mortalities of people have increased over time as well, especially between 2014 to 2016. The South African National Parks haven't released any official numbers yet. They stopped doing that after about 2014. And they also stopped releasing numbers of rhino in the park as well. So a lot of these are still our estimates. So they're being quite cagey about a lot of the work that's getting done. This isn't unique just to the Kruger National Park or South Africa. We're seeing a huge number of private operations that are happening across the continent. For example, African Parks is protecting over 19 different parks across the continent on behalf of governments, and most of them are national parks. We've actually been doing some research in Garamba, and so the following 2 photographs of some of the same guys, these are pictures that myself and Jordana took of the anti-poaching team helping us doing some swabs of, here you can see elephant dung. These rangers were very interested in the conservation elements and the technologies that we were talking about from a genomics perspective, and we're really keen to be involved. I think they're really tired of toting, the AKs around and the likes, and are more excited about kind of old school conservation mechanisms and approaches than what they're being faced with nowadays. So this privatization of conservation in Africa, as I mentioned,
Simon,
here,
just on that slide,
yeah.
Could you say a word about an average education background of who becomes a conservation ranger? Like this picture we're looking at, what is the background
Yes.
of individuals? Are they local? What are the
These are
potentials in the education context when you think about these individuals being trained for the next generation of technologies?
Yeah, so that's a huge element that you've got to take into account, because a lot of these individuals haven't been into school beyond very low grades. There are some exceptions that you find. So the head of research in this park was also from a local community nearby, and he actually completed his master's in China after learning how to speak Mandarin, and got a degree, and is actually looking to do his PhD, hopefully on genomics as well. But so there is a huge range, but by and large, the field rangers that you see working have very low levels of education. So a lot of the tools that we're thinking about, especially from a genomics perspective, trying to think about simple mechanisms that can be deployed effectively and also being carried by these guys in their backpack. So, thinking about the devices, the swabs, for example, and trying to make them as robust as possible, as well as stable as possible for as long as possible in various conditions and heats and the like. Obviously, from a genetic perspective, you've also got worry a lot about contamination within these environments and trying to minimize that. So hence the gloves. But so those are definitely things from thinking about developing technologies that you've got to take into account is, what can these guys effectively carry with them for 4 or 5 days and do sampling while they're out and about. So a huge element of privatization and conservation across the continent, which is largely to the benefit of conservation, and we're starting to see governments willing to hand over what we term paper parks. So these are protected areas that they just haven't been able to invest in at all. Hand them over to an organization like African Parks, which is able to secure them for 20, 30-year long periods, able to get donor funding and to come in and secure the spaces and try and rewild these areas. So a lot of these areas are being rewilded. And I just wanted to very briefly show you some of the thinking that African Parks is bringing into the space that's very science-based and evidence-based approaches that they're starting to develop. And I think that this is going to be a huge value from the privatization of conservation in many of these areas, especially if we're able to do it over very long periods of time.
So this can you just say a word about African Parks as an organization? Like what is African Parks?
So African Parks is an NGO. They're actually based out of South Africa, but they don't manage any parks in South Africa themselves. And they work with governments to secure protected areas and take over complete management. So they do everything from the anti-poaching through to tourism, as well as community engagement. And they sign these parks, as I say, for between 25 to 30 years. And before they sign, they go and seek funding, kind of base funding. I think they try and cover at least 40% of their funding needs for that period of time. They try and secure before they even sign a park. And their mission is to have 20 parks by this year, and they're well on their way. They've got 19 national parks at the moment in 11 different countries, and they cover about 15 million hectares of protected area across those spaces, across the different biomes as well.
And we should think of this as that they have the jurisdiction in these parks, or are they support organization?
They've got entire management jurisdiction. So, for example, when we look at these guys are African Parks employees. So African Parks will only take on management if they can hire and fire, is basically their kind of policy, because they want to make sure that they can come in with a clean slate. They're not carrying any. Unfortunately, with a lot of government jobs, as we all know, it's once people are in a government job, it's very hard to get to move them along if need be. So they come in and they will re-employ everybody if everybody passes through the application process, and they'll do all the required training and all the rest of it. And they do work as much as possible with the local communities in the areas from an employment perspective. So they are very cognizant of that. Yeah, they're a great organization, but unfortunately to date, they haven't had a huge monitoring element associated with what they're doing, and they slowly, as I say, bringing this on board with an evidence-based approach, and focusing on long-term impacts, looking at system drivers within the space. So, for example, in Bazaruta National Park, this is from one of their presentations that they recently did, and thinking about the impacts that they want to have in an area. So, in this case, it was a persistence of dugongs in the space. They identified their outcomes. So, for dugongs to persist, they needed to reduce mortalities from bycatch and from the local fishermen, and they needed to maintain the seagrass that the dugongs feed on. And to be able to have those outcomes, they needed to reduce the use of the sign nets within the area. And to be able to do that, they need to introduce alternative fishing methods and livelihoods. So, really bringing these kind of long-term impacts, thinking about these drivers and using strategic planning to help shift the focus a little bit to these key impact drivers and their objectives, and to try and define the input and output required to achieve these long-term impacts and outputs. And they get quite involved with this across, the social, economic, and environmental mechanisms. And, failure at the end of their mandate, which would be the 20 to 30 year period, would see everything moving across, and the impacts not garnered. But going through all of these processes and really trying to understand these inputs that they need to have the desired impacts to drive them towards a long-term vision for the park. So this type of thing is really possible within the privatization of these areas, because you also, a key factor that we mentioned earlier was corruption. Is by having a privatization of the parks, we see reduction levels greatly reduced, and interest by international partners to be able to come in with the required funding to be able to do a lot of this kind of work. So when we look at all of these protected areas, one thing I chatted to Manu that I'd mention is the impact that COVID's had within these spaces. So a friend of mine, Peter Lindsay, recently put a paper together looking at the impact that COVID-19 would have on the kind of conservation models that are currently deployed within the space. So if we focus in on here and we look at the pandemic, and we know that the economies are going to shrink, what that means is that we're going to see a decline in tourism and as well as hunting within Africa. We also, with the international economy shrinking, going to see the philanthropic donations probably starting to decline, and have seen this for sure. State conservation funding is going to decline, and all of this means less funding for conservation impacts out there. So which means that our effective management is going to start declining. Also, this lack of funding, we'll see conservation benefits decreasing, local food security and poverty increasing. And so the story goes until eventually starting to see biodiversity losses as we see threats increasing, for example, the poaching. And essentially what this means is that our confidence in the current conservation models is going to decline, and we're going to start realizing that we need new resilient conservation models over time. And I think a lot of this is also going to be driven by, as he pointed out here, the global existence value of African biodiversity, as people are starting to realize, and I think starting to place more value on biodiversity globally, and also realizing that Africa has a huge role to play in that. So what are these resilient conservation models, and what do they look like, is really what we need to be spending a lot of time on and thinking about, because we're already starting to see what Peter highlighted here happening in the conservation space. These are a couple of examples that they highlighted, and one or two that you might not think about. Here we look in Malawi, where they're releasing prisoners to take pressure off the prison systems. But some of these prisoners will include key poaching syndicate members. So, for example, kingpins being released. We're seeing huge losses of revenue, for example, in Zim and South Africa, and in fact across the board, from a lack of tourism into the area. Tanzania, we've already talked about. Here we're starting to see the hunting concessions are being degazetted. So that's the Selous that we spoke about, and seeing them looking see them looking for alternative development opportunities, as we're starting to see these impacts happening. And this is happening rapidly, and we're starting to see a loss of protected areas for sure.
Simon, Subir has a question. Subir, can you unmute yourself and ask the question around the conflicts, or the two questions that you had? I think this is a perfect time. Go ahead, Subir.
Hi. So the question,
Maybe
I was wondering,
one line.
Can you hear me?
Simon knows who you are.
Hi, I'm from India. I'm Subir, and I just make prototypes. But I'm keen to know if conservation is a local problem or a global problem, and what happens when local citizenship or local citizens are bypassed. What is their interest in conservation? I mean, will it be more sustainable if conservation is also a local value, local interest?
It's a key element, and I think all too often it has been bypassed, and we've seen that the local communities haven't had a seat at the table, and that's whether it's from a natural resource extraction perspective in an area, right through to tourism lodges, hunting concessions, and the trophy hunting fees that are paid. We see that all too often that the communities essentially are just getting kind of scraps from the table at the end of the day. So a lot of the money flows completely around the communities on all different levels, and that's largely due to corruption and largely due to international interests coming in, Western influence coming in and taking over the kind of the lion's share as such within these spaces. So that kind of leads into this, which is kind of thinking about some of these conservation funding gaps that exist and that are more inclusive of communities. So at the moment, there's a lot of, as we've said, there's a lot of tourism which can be very exclusive of communities. There can be a lot of international aid that comes in that I often feel like is a little bit of a handout, and in itself can be a little bit patronizing in a way. And I think that there definitely could be better approaches to it. So, what Peter and his team identified was, increased thinking around multiple land use approaches of protected areas. So you can think about sustainable rangeland management in and around protected areas, which could create resilient income for private and community landowners while achieving ecological goals. I think all too often conservationists are scared of livestock instead of embracing livestock and kind of utilizing the bulk grazers that they are in an effective way in hand with the communities. We can also look at sustainable consumptive use, for example, game meat or fishing within protected areas and waterways sustainably as a way of being more inclusive of local communities and looking at historical use within a space. We can obviously think about payment for ecosystem services. There's been a lot of work done with the carbon credits, but maybe expanding that into things like biodiversity credits or water credits within a space. Getting creative around cultural services, for example, encouraging the industry and businesses to contribute each time, say, an animal appears in their adverts or media to raise money for wildlife conservation or habitats and animal welfare. We've seen this happening with the Lion Share Fund, where the conservation community is trying to capitalize on the African lion brand that's being used extensively by large corporations and kind of taxing them for that. There's also been a little bit of work recently being done on debt for nature swaps. So many countries are highly indebted with debt repayments, which consume up to 22% of Africa's budgets. And a comprehensive debt moratorium could release over $50 billion debt for nature swaps that could forgive debt while mandating local investments in natural assets. So there's a number of different ways that I think we could be more inclusive of communities in the surrounding spaces, and being innovative about how we approach these things and kind of move from the current to the future scenario that's a lot more diversified and resilient to these kind of impacts. Does that answer some of your questions?
Yeah.
Okay. Is there anything further that's come from that? Any thoughts around some of these kind of alternative scenarios?
Yeah, I think I'm monitoring the questions, so I'll bring those up.
Okay. Okay, cool. So when we look at the sustainable consumptive use, one thing I wanted to highlight and talk about was sustainable utilization, because it has been used extensively and bandied around in Africa, and there's different schools of thought around sustainable utilization. So if we focus in again in the Zululand area, where we've been doing a lot of work, in the eastern side of South Africa, and we look at the white rhino conservation of the past, not many people know that the white rhino population crashed to around 20 to 30 individuals in the late 1800s. They were all protected within this one park called Mfolozi Park. And if we look at the recovery of the white rhino, we'll see that, it did quite well, and we can see that it really started ramping up in the late 60s, and this was led by a conservationist called Ian Player, and he started up Operation Rhino, and this is when they were first learning how to catch rhino. It was a little bit of back in the days of the cowboy kind of approach. As you can imagine, a lot of broken bones and a lot of trial and error with various drugs that was used, and the population did really well with this, and it was essentially just trying to get the eggs out of the basket. But one thing that not many people know is that, coupled with this, and one of the reasons that they could move these rhinos is what they were selling them, and they started rhino commercialization at the same time and started allowing hunting. And we saw about a 10% of the population being hunted over time, mostly privately owned animals. There's obviously a big focus in on big horned individuals, and over time, what we started seeing is that, especially in the early 2000s, is that we started seeing a new kind of hunter come to the party that weren't kind of conventional hunters, and it started getting stranger and stranger, to the point where we were finding hunters that weren't even pulling the trigger, that were just signing the documents to be along on the hunt. And essentially what was happening is that these trophy animals were being exported, the trophies, and that the horns were being cut off and sold illegally into the market. So in 2007, the South African government implemented strict permit restrictions on these population, on the CITES permits and the trophy hunting permits in South Africa. And almost immediately, we saw an increase in poaching from 2007 until the present. And I've shown you some of these numbers already, where we saw this dramatic increase in poaching happening from 2007 as we implemented these stricter controls around the trophy hunting. At the same time, what's interesting to note is that there was a middle income wealth increase in China from the mid 2000s, and there was an increased expenditure on luxury goods. Here we can see an increase in jewelry, gold, and diamonds retail sale prices, sales within China at the time. There, I've just marked with the gray line, you can see that kind of 2007 point. And at the same time as that, in 2008, we saw ivory and elephant poaching taking off. And this was coupled in 2008 with the once-off ivory sales. So ivory was banned. There's a big international ban. And a couple of countries put forward a request to trade in ivory in 2008. And we had these once-off sales. And you can see what happens in the run, in the kind of lead up to the once-off sale. There's a lot of speculation that starts taking place, and a knowledge that the syndicates are going to be able to create counterfeit certificates and to be able to move ivory. And we can see that the market was receptive, and there was an increase in the market for ivory. And follow on is by 2012, we're seeing a huge poaching increase of elephant. And if we go back to our Nyasa and Selous and areas, just as an example, we're seeing huge losses over a 5-year period, almost 2/3 loss of elephants within these protected areas. And a lot of that driven by the ability for counterfeits and an opening in the demand and the markets in China. So, with all of this happening, a lot of people query, well, what are some of the solutions? And people go back to these once-off sales and said, well, during those once-off sales, we made a lot of money off the selling of the ivory, and we were able to put that into conservation efforts. It obviously wasn't enough, and we should have sold more ivory, and we could have kind of controlled these issues. From a rhino perspective, we see farmers starting to farm rhino. This here is John Hume. He's quite a famous South African who owns over 2,000 white rhino himself. So a private individual owning 10% of the world's white rhino population. And his whole objective is to grow rhino horns. He chops them off every year, and he's got a massive stockpile worth billions, and he's just waiting for the market to open up. And he's been lobbying heavily for the South African government to open up the trade, because he believes by trading in the rhino horn that he'll be able to generate revenue for the protection, and as well as to meet the market demands. So if we turn around and have a look at this approach and this kind of trading of wildlife and farming of wildlife, there's a couple of examples. So in China, this is a tiger farm, and there's over 8,000 tigers in captivity in farm conditions in China. In the US, there's over 5,000 captive tigers, and in the wild, we see only 3,500. So we've got to ask ourselves whether the approach of farming wildlife for the sake of protecting those in the wild is having the desired outcome. And I'd argue that it's not necessarily doing that. And one of the problems is that as soon as with any luxury good, there's always going to be a market for fakes, and whether that's from a wild perspective and counterfeiting, or from a different species. So for example, in South Africa, the captive lion population in the last 10 years has shot up, and we've got over 12,000 lions that have been bred in captivity specifically for the point of exporting their bones for the lion trade. Again, all of the farmers are punting that, by doing this, that they're protecting the wild populations. And unfortunately, what we're starting to see is an increase in lion poaching and African lion mortalities. So this is the latest data that we've kind of got in, where we're starting to see this increase in mortality, specifically for body parts. And these are all from wild populations. So the debate really is, should we be destroying these stockpiles, attaching no value to them and being open about it, or should we be returning to these kind of trade issues and trying to play with these various markets? And that's a debate that's still raging on today. We've been working a lot with the South African government, who's busy trying to make that decision at the moment around captive breeding of lions, captive breeding of rhino and rhino horn trade and ivory trade is still going on today. And we're still seeing the continued poaching. So those were the broader issues that I just wanted to kind of bring to the table and share with everybody, and some of the issues that we're facing currently.
A question on, you really left us all on a cliffhanger with this decision side.
Yes.
Which is, I mean, it's fascinating as the fact that, you know, from a past evidence, I'm just curious if you could say a word or two about incentive structures that are in place right now for,
Yes.
you know, when you look at the example of tigers and lions and really transitioning into as if it was animal farming,
Yeah.
what's the incentive structure that is being proposed in this White Rhino project? What percentage of the money that this farmer makes is actually going to conservation of rhinos and
Well,
holds the lines around there? Just what is the actual proposal that is being debated at this moment?
so the proposal is to take the stockpiles that the South African government has, which are fairly extensive, of rhino horn, for example, and allow the trade of private individuals. So the private rhino owners are basically saying, you know, they've been landed with this responsibility of looking after, you know, they look after about 40% of the white rhino population. How are they paying for it? And, you know, when they're in farm conditions like that, they're not really conducive to tourism at all. You know, tourists are wanting to go and see wild rhinos for the large part. And so they're stating, you know, allow us to trade in the horn and we'll protect these populations. But it's a bit of a circular argument, because if you weren't allowing the hunting and the sustainable utilization in the first place, we wouldn't have allowed these kind of markets to be developed and to kind of grow. And I would argue that it would almost be better to have, you know, the 8,000 rhino only in the Kruger National Park that are not being poached, versus having, you know, that population decimated and removed, and having 20,000 rhinos in the hands of some private rhino owners under those conditions. So we've really got to kind of ask ourselves, you know, under what do we see the future of wildlife to look like, especially around some of these species that are heavily traded. And the same goes for the lion. You know, all of the guys owning lion are saying, you know, if you just let us continue farming these lions, we can continue providing and meet the market demands and reduce the pressure on the wild populations. But the point is, it wasn't the pressure on the wild populations in the first place anyway. So it's a huge issue, because they also turn around and say, well, what now do we do with all of these lions? You know, we've got 10,000 lions in captivity. If we stop selling their bones, who pays for their food? Who looks after them? And then what happens? So we don't have any solutions at the moment necessarily. We've all got different ideas around how this might play out. But this is a problem that's facing us as we speak, and government's trying to make these decisions at the moment.
So let's open up to a broader discussion. And I think maybe, Simon, you could just say a word about, because many of the folks gathered in this group and many of us think about the role of frugal technologies in these entire, say a few words about current accessibility to tracking technologies in the context of poaching itself. I know there's a lot of genetics work that's been done on tracking where something came from, forensics technologies. If you had a wish list of things that people should be working on, what would that look like? Just your general remarks, and then we'll make it very specific discussions.
Sure. So I think,
and we have had this conversation many times, but I think I just want everybody else to sort of be in that.
No, for sure, sure. I think what's an interesting element to consider is that if you go around to many conservation managers and current practitioners, and if you had to ask them that very question, you know, what do you need? A lot of them will tell you that a lot of the solutions or tools that are out there are actually just not accessible, or haven't been showcased, or haven't been bought and training done and all the rest of it. So there's a lot of solutions that are out there, but just aren't being implemented because there's a bit of a gap in kind of understanding knowledge, finances, and the likes. So I think as a starting point, I think it's important to just consider that, that often that there are solutions, but they're just not being used. And then I think on the second level, you know, the technology spans so many different elements, and I think for me, one of the elements from a genetic perspective, again, is making these tools, as I was saying earlier, kind of more robust and rugged and accessible, and thinking a lot about replicability within these landscapes, and also contamination issues and the likes, and then the very low education levels in terms of being able to access and what to do with the samples and what that means and where do they go. One of the biggest factors that we face through all of it from a genetic perspective is just getting samples out of a country. As hugely problematic. So as much of the work that can be done in country as possible is also essential. So a lot of the, you know, whether we can get extractions done on site simply, PCR products, for example, are much easier to move, or fecal materials, for example, don't have as many restrictions around them, but obviously we've got to consider the zoonotic risks, and disease risks, and the likes.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is also why I see beautiful parallels between technologies being developed for human health to truly being deployed in conservation. It's just, there is a real deep link there. And then with respect to the comment that you made around, you know, forensic side of the story, is there a parallel in terms of thinking about when so much of the illegal trades are being caught around the world? How do you trace that back to where it's coming from? Are we in a state where we truly have the forensics network in place to, from a technology point of view?
Yeah, so
what have you seen in the last 5-10 years that has really dazzled you to, this is what we really need?
So, and it's a lot of what we actually trying to work on from a Genoscape perspective, so that we're able to place unknown samples straight into there. So I think that unfortunately there's a bit of a stumbling block in terms of getting those baselines established using good quality samples, so that we can then kind of focus in on the degraded samples using a multiplex PCR approach, which we've been developing as well, and which has proven effective in trying to identify those SNPs. So I think that's really where it's going to go, is where, again, where we're learning a lot from the human space and trying to adapt and bring it across into the wildlife space. But thinking about the wildlife management and forensics very much from like a 23andMe for wildlife approach, and where we can also help managers send in samples, and it can be kind of done less in a research space and more in an applied environment, where there's kind of a service providers that are able to very simply receive degraded samples, that they're very limited kind of export controls and the likes, or getting it done locally, but being able to answer questions about relatedness, migration between populations and the likes, and the differences in what they're seeing, and or being able to link individuals to databases. So if there's a confiscated sample picked up in in California, we'd be able to tell you, listen, that line's actually a wild lion and it originated out of Tanzania, very simply, and that it's related to this individual in the database, and that we've got the tools to be able to do something like that. So I think that's really exciting within the genomic space, is those kind of approaches. But I think what's key is trying to identify those tools that enable that along the way, so that the practitioners on the ground can very simply access a sample, query a sample. So thinking about kind of sample and answer kind of approaches for certain things. Is it this species or is it that species? So DNA detection, for example, is important as well.
Yeah, let's open to broader questions. If people want to just open their cameras. Tyler, if you could just make everybody's, Harish has his hands up, and then people can just raise hands. Rishi, go ahead.
Hi, Simon. I'm Rishi. I'm a computational biologist. So it looks like it's like a demand and supply problem, and it looks like for some reason demand is high, given for whatever weird purposes people want to use the. So I guess Is that so high enough that somebody can basically grow rhino horn in a petri plate and, I don't know, dry it and supply it and whatever they want to drink, mix it and drink that way? I mean,
Very good question.
how does one destroy the demand for it?
Yeah, so the demand is an interesting one. So I think that there's two kind of elements to your point there, Rishi. And I think, so from a demand perspective, if we look at the panda as an example, very quickly the Chinese government was able to control the pandas. It became a revered species, very well looked after, and that was a simple step that, and so behaviors changed around the use of panda and how the panda was kind of viewed. So I think it is possible to change people's kind of perceptions of things if we've got good political will right at the top. And unless there's good political will, we're going to struggle all the way down. And that's what we're really lacking at the moment on all levels, from countries that have the species themselves, so from a South African government perspective, through to Vietnamese government or Chinese government and the like perspective. There's just not enough political will involved around any of these issues. And if there was, I think we would be able to have a much bigger impact in our demand reduction strategies. There's also a lot of debate around the continued trade of a lot of these products, and that also sows a lot of kind of doubt within the end users around some of the demand reduction messaging that they might be getting. And then in terms of your comment around kind of creating some of these products, there was a company, Pembient in California, I think it was, that was wanting to do 3D printing of rhino horn and felt that they could do it very effectively, and that you wouldn't be able to, if you tested the product, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. The problem with that is that it probably would still be fairly expensive. If we then started trading in that product, we're now saying it's of value, that there's some medicinal value or something to it. So we're going to start increasing the demand for this type of product. We're going to create fake avenues to be able to get illegal product out, and it's always going to be cheaper to poach. And then a lot of the use of the products is actually based around the essence and the wild essence of these animals, based on traditions and cultures associated with the use of the products. So what we'll start seeing is a premium being put on the wild products, and mechanisms to be able to differentiate between the two. And as soon as you start doing that, we'll start seeing poaching actually increase, because it's more lucrative to go after wild products. So we end up putting a lot more pressure on them. And then the final point around that is that if we trace the money back and we look at all the corruption issues that we face in Africa, we won't necessarily see those conservation dollars being applied in the conservation sector. So the protection of those wild populations is probably not going to be done as well as what it should be. I always, when we talk about trade issues, I always try and highlight to people, it's not Switzerland trying to sell chocolate to Sweden. This is African governments trading with Asian governments around some of these high value products, and a lot of it, unfortunately, is under the table.
Yeah,
and
that's
actually,
a good.
with that example, there is also a tad bit of Silicon Valley hype associated with technology. I mean, in health, we've been trying to grow simple bones for people, and we haven't succeeded so far. But again, suddenly this product, it's just, it raises eyebrows in many different ways. Where I think the approach is, technology will solve all problems, which is an issue.
So quick follow-up question. I don't want to monopolize the time, but so what made the Chinese government start revering the panda? And is there like a story documented? And what if, why, if panda, then why not rhino? What do people need to do to make it like make Chinese officials sit up and take notice and say, okay, it's a sacred animal, we should be going the panda way?
Exactly. So there's a lot of political will that's required around that on both sides, but that is definitely something that's on the radar. It will have to be done at a precise time for those conversations to be had at that level. I think by and large, a lot of these issues just are not falling on the radar of a lot of the politicians at the right level to be able to make these decisions. But if we are able to kind of get to that point, I think that those are the kind of conversations we need to have, where we start recognizing some of these species as kind of global heritage species, just as we might do with the World Heritage Sites. We think about World Heritage species, but I think we need to take it a step further beyond the World Heritage Sites, which don't actually get a lot of benefit to the countries that have them or have to look after them. And we as a global community need to be kind of stepping up to the plate and providing kind of incentives for that to happen, for those protections to be able to happen. And then specifically in terms of the conditions, and that these animals need to be protected in the wild and not under farm conditions.
Thank you, Simon.
Let's open to more questions. This is sort of an open discussion.
Sure.
I don't know if Emmanuel. Oh, let me just wait for you, Subir. If there is any other question from other folks as well, just Sheetal, Emmanuel. I saw some hands. Yeah, go ahead, Sheetal. You had several questions in the chat.
So I was thinking that Tyler mentioned that this is more of a hype. If it's more of a hype, then why not disprove it by actually considering some research? I mean, backing it up, saying that there is no medicinal effect related to collecting rhino horns.
Yeah. So there has been some research that's been done to that effect and has been shown. Unfortunately, the value, so rhino horn value goes up sometimes over $60,000 a kilogram. So it's more lucrative than cocaine and gold and per weight. And the amount of money being spent, these syndicates are just able to refute a lot of these things, and they push their own markets and their own agendas. So really difficult to work in these spaces. And they just keep marketing it themselves. It's to their value. So to be able to kind of counter spend is hugely problematic in terms of trying to get that messaging out. And a lot of the time they might just laugh it off and say, well, they can't. That's just science. I mean, we've seen that happen extensively, even in different areas. So it's a tough one, especially when there's a lot of cultural heritage involved around some of these things. And then there's a lot of whether it's hype. There's also one of our biggest dreads was that somebody was going to come out around something about curing COVID or something like that related to a wildlife species, because that would have been hugely problematic. But those are the types of things that kind of are sparked by these syndicates, that they'll kind of release this kind of information just to try and drive markets in some of these products. But that's the type of thing that we need to be doing in conjunction with everything else. So we need to come with that evidence. We need to come with the political will. We need to come with the demand reduction campaigns and a cohesive approach, rather than this. At the moment, there's a lot of split because of the private ownership of these species and the money to be made, or the perceived money to be made.
Mm-hmm. Other comments and questions? I think there was a question early on about the carbon bonds, and if any of those methods have actually led to significant chunks of money. Sasha, go ahead. You had a question around that.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know when they were introduced. So so my name is Sasha. I'm a data scientist with background in physics. So I'm not really knowledgeable in that field. But when they came out, I want to say like 10 years ago, I thought that might be a nice idea. I know yes, that it's maybe not a good idea to put always a value on something which might be invaluable. But I thought that, am I still there? Oh, shit.
Yep,
yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, okay. That it might give actually money to local communities if you say, okay, rainforest produces that or takes that much CO2 and it's much more valuable than the wood inside or something. But it feels to me that it didn't have the impact people had hoped. So is the reason that the price is not high enough, or was it just not the right idea?
No, I think it's a combination of different factors. We try to look at it. It needs to be done at scale for it to work. So a lot of these projects are beyond the means of local communities being able to enact upon them themselves and being able to drive them. So it requires a lot of NGO presence, or it's happened at a government level, And as soon as things are at a government level in a lot of these places, we don't see the trickle down effects into the communities. There are definitely some examples of it working, the Red Plus projects in certain areas being effective, but always driven by an interested party that comes along and has to hold hands and really drive the process and maintain the process. So I think it's still got a long way to go before we see it kind of reaching its full potential. But I think you raise an important point around, what's the intrinsic value of some of these things and how do we value that versus putting just a dollar value on things and trying to calculate it, because that can be problematic. And what the long-term vision is of that. I think definitely in time we're going to see these kind of biodiversity credits or carbon credits, water credits and the likes starting to gain favor as people start realizing the true value that these systems have from an ecosystem services perspective. So I think that those countries that are able to kind of contain vast areas of wilderness through this time while we're still figuring it out are definitely going to come up tops. I think an important point on that, Manu, which I don't know if Liz has discussed with you, but we are looking at developing a venture studio, and there's a venture capitalist that's come into play that has kind of identified conservation as the next big thing and is wanting to invest heavily in these technologies and thinking around, because you can see, this is where it's going to go. And part of the thing is I'm having these metrics, and how do we measure the carbon or the water quality or the the biodiversity within these spaces? Is acoustic measurement the best, or do we need camera traps, or do we, environmental DNA and all of these different types of things, or was it a combination of it? And I think so. There's definitely a growing interest in the sector, and I think it's definitely going to start ramping up over the next decade for sure.
Yeah, I think a comment on this is as the numbers keep dwindling and they get smaller and smaller, the data and the the value of people being able to see these animals, it just grows significantly. And I think there is a sense of panic in the community when that panic sets in, and the fact that many of the large species that have gone extinct, then do they become the champions that this is the history to be not repeated in some way? And it's just a multi-front. That's really what makes it very challenging, because it's happening all around on all fronts at the same time. I wanted to go ahead.
So just one thing on that is and when we think of corruption and how we value and how we monitor and how we drive benefit down to local communities, one example with a group that we're chatting it to now, and they've been monitoring tree loss and linking that to financial benefits to farmers, community-based farmers, and providing them incentives in the form of reduced interest rates on loans that they take out to buy seed or for equipment and all the rest of it, and have managed to kind of link this remote monitoring to beneficiation down on the ground at a community level quite effectively. And by being able to do so, trying to minimize the middleman, aka the government, as much as possible, and trying to ensure that there's kind of benefits and or monitoring and happening that can kind of come down on the ground. And I think that's where there needs to be a big focus going forward, is how do we engage meaningfully on the ground with communities. A lot of people in Africa are connected via cell phone technologies, and how do payments kind of go directly to individuals rather than these kind of, whether even community trusts have proven hugely problematic in terms of benefits flowing down ineffectively, and governments, we've seen the same. And I think that's really where the future is going to be, is kind of dealing directly with people one-on-one, and being able to kind of ensure that benefits are going in the hands of the people on the ground. And I think that's a space from a technology perspective to be thinking about.
I always like ending on positive notes, and that was a very somber talk, Simon. So, I mean, first of all, thank you so much. But I want you to make a comment. No, I think the reality, we had the same experience just Tuesday as well. Again, I think we are all very realist, and this needs to be front and center of our everyday. I mean, many of us won't sleep tonight just thinking about those pictures as well. Sure. And I think, this is part and center of your life. It's very valuable to actually hear these stories. I want on the positive side, and many of us think quite a lot about education and its role, and especially educational technologies that are changing life from the ground. I'm curious about if you could expand on, and many of the folks involved in this class are working on educational technologies as well. When it comes down to the next generation, what is the message we have for 15-year-olds growing right next to the park? What can we provide and support? What class of products, what class of services that they become the world experts in these species that are in their backyard? What does it mean from a context of them having resources to support their families, even if they're not physically there? I'm just curious, the conservation effort, and especially in African parks context, I can see universal access to so many countries coming in a much more structured manner. So at the forefront, any positive stories around the educational aspects?
There's huge numbers of positive stories, and I'm sorry to bring a lot of the issues to the fore, but
that's
I think
exactly
it is important
why I called you.
to bring context to some of these thinking, and to realize that it's not always just a simple process. But from a conservation education perspective, the most exciting thing is going out with kids into these wilderness areas and spending time with them and seeing it through their eyes and giving them that opportunity. And I think just that first step is opportunity. That is often people forget that not everybody has an opportunity to get into a wildlife space, a wilderness space, and to view animals as something else other than a food source, or as a source of conflict, or whatever it might be. So that's where we focus a lot of our attention, is actually trying to build that emotional kind of connection with young children within a wildlife space. And then really thinking about, I think about the folder scope and things like that kind of give them an alternative view, a different view, something that they hadn't kind of considered before. So one element is just being in a space like that in wilderness and opening the eyes and the heart to those environments. And then the second is giving them kind of these alternative insights and ways of looking at things that perhaps they hadn't considered before. So I think anything that can do that and drive the questioning, which I think is what a lot of your guys' work is doing so effectively and so well, it's incredible to kind of see those results coming from those youngsters. And we follow a lot of children in rural areas through these processes and out into tertiary education, and it definitely works, and we definitely see the fruits of that. So keep on with that thinking and with those approaches, and I think just trying to get kids out there as a step one, and giving them some cool tools along the way is key.
So it's 2:04. Unless somebody has a burning question, we were going to close. I think Simon, one request I have for you, and there is one team working on trapping of animals and associated injuries with it. And I'll connect that team with you, or I don't know if that team is already online. Simon's email, we can post. You could reach out to him directly. He's a lot of experience in capturing animals, would be able to provide feedback on that front. We're trying to rethink that question in terms of the harm that some of the trapping technologies cause.
Exactly, and I think trying to drive those non-invasive monitoring techniques are critical. The first step should be, how can we do this without touching the animal, and then from there, if we have to, then
and I think
sure.
the question is,
I'd love to engage.
Then how do we reduce the harm?
Exactly. Yeah, we do a lot of that type of work. So, and would love to invite you over to come and participate when you guys are allowed back in here.
Yeah. I think we all are feeling the burst. There is going to be a burst of travel. I'm telling you, the moment COVID shuts.
I know. It's going to be great.
Yeah. On that note, I really want to thank Simon and everybody else joining in. We'll see you Tuesday. Thank you so much, Simon, for sharing this. This was an incredible, and for many of us, eye-opener in many ways.
Great. Well, thanks for the opportunity, and thanks everyone for listening in. It was great and great to engage. Thanks very much. Cheers.
And then next week, we will send out, I think, Tyler, have we sent out the dates for final presentations as yet?
People have signed up. So for the most part, folks are signed up mostly for Thursday. But if you've not yet signed up, make sure you do put your name in one of those slots. This is not like a huge pressure kind of thing. We want each of these to be like a little discussion so we can sort of, celebrate what you've done and also, ask questions and think about, the future of this project. So actually signing up for Tuesday, since looks like there are fewer teams, that might actually be better for you because maybe you get more time. So do sign up. It's in the announcements.
Let me clarify this. I would like all teams to actually take a spot, because remember, these are moments when you get to use everybody else's brain to think about your questions. So, many of you are not taking this class for grades or any evaluation. We do this because we love all of this work. So make sure that you're signing up, because we would just do this as feedback sessions. And I think the goal of this is our work will not stop. And I hope it better not stop, because we know the issues are so large. The end of the class is just as a way of holding kind of a formal ending to the class. But in the end, that session really allows us to focus on sets of projects where a ton of thinking has gone in, so we can align the kind of resources. So it's a filtration process in some sense in your own thinking as well, to say, now I've proven to myself that this direction, this approach, this question is deeply important to me. So do this as a self-reflection exercise, and then we are all there for listening in that process.
Yeah, and the videos that we mentioned, which we're hoping to have you record, that's more of like the formal style presentation where you just get the chance to sort of review the work that you've done, so that someone in the future can watch that and say, oh, this is a very useful way of getting to know this topic area in addition to your Notion page. That video that you're recording is, all of you should turn it in by Thursday, but that doesn't necessarily, I think, need to be done by when you present in class. Is that right, Manu?
Yeah. It's I think, from a timing, I guess I'll send out a message, or Tyler, we should just discuss and send out the message so the dates are the same.
Yeah, sounds perfect.
Yeah. All right, bye everybody.
Thanks everyone.
Some resolution of the people don't just walk over the Constitution and something right happens in this country. I'm really hoping for some change this week.
That would be awesome. See y'all.